Hey everybody, Adam Welsh back with you for another episode of Straight Talk on Photography. This is the follow-up episode of that first impression video on the Hasselblad X1D medium format mirrorless digital camera. It's a sad day, folks. I'm not going to kid you. Today's the day I have to send this beautiful camera back to Hasselblad. I've shot with it for a few weeks and I want to tell you what I think about it right now. If you're not familiar with the Hasselblad X1D, it is the first marketed medium format mirrorless digital camera. The sensor size of the Hasselblad is 43.8 millimeters by 32.9 millimeters. So you'll call it a 44 by 33 millimeter sensor. That's a pretty good size digital sensor. I thought I'd read somewhere that the Hasselblad sensor was smaller than the Fujifilm GFX50. That's actually not the case. They are exactly the same sensors in terms of manufacture. They're both made by Sony. In terms of size and the megapixel, they're both 51 megapixel. Pixel pitch is the same. If that concerns you, it's 5.3 microns, but the clincher, it has 14 stops of dynamic range. The human eye has about 20. That means the X1D sensor, lots of exposure latitude. As far as medium format sensors goes, this is not as big as the Phase 1 medium format digital camera. That has a 53.7 by 40.4 millimeter sensor in it. So it's a lot bigger sensor than the Phase 1. I've never used a Phase 1, so I can't really speak to that, but you can find a ton of videos on YouTube. I suggest you check out The Art of Photography by Ted Forbes. Excellent information on really everything, but he did a few video series of the Phase 1 and he loved it. Something very cool about the X1D that I found, at least, it has two different aspect ratios. You can shoot in the 4:3, which is essentially an 8:10 aspect ratio, but you can actually turn it to a 1:1 aspect ratio like the 120 film, and that's what I want to talk about right now. The X1D has an extremely filmy feel to the images. It has that larger sensor, and a larger sensor relative to your lens makes for some different effects when it comes to background blur and the way the image actually looks physically. This means that even with a 90mm lens, this camera has a 0.8 crop factor. So a 90mm lens is not quite as tight as it would be on, let's say, a full frame digital camera or a crop sensor digital camera. So you have a lot larger frame of view, and like I said, you would just have to, we'll look at the images in just a second, but coming from a lot of film, I shoot 4:5, large format, medium format, 35mm, it just sings to you. If you love that look of medium format film, it really looks great. The images are absolutely fantastic. Speaking of that, this, folks, has the best contrast and color. Dare I say, I haven't tested any of the other Hasselblad lenses with this, just the 90mm. The contrast on this is absolutely insane. The image quality is insane. And like I said, that dynamic range, 14 stops, it's absolutely beautiful in terms of the quality of images that this thing produces. And honestly, it should. The X1D has a EVF, electronic viewfinder, and an LCD. Some people have complained it's not as good of a quality as they would expect. Honestly, I think it's just fine. The EVF on this is 2.36 million dots. I think the Fujifilm GFX50, 3.36 dots on that EVF. So this one is not quite as crisp as the GFX would be. Again, guys, I didn't see any problem with it, but you know, that is just me. Personally, I don't think you're going to have a problem with it either. Now, before we move on to some of the stuff I didn't like about the X1D, let's talk about the size of it. I mentioned in the last video, I was stunned at how really compact this camera is. It's not the beast that I was expecting when I had it first sent from Hasselblad. Even with the 90mm on here, take the lens hood off, it's actually really small. And when you compare it to a Sony A7R, this is my Mark I, this is my old buddy, the size is not that in your face different. That was actually very surprising to me. That has a 24 to 70mm on there, by the way, and just so you hadn't forgot, that's the 90mm. So yeah, especially in the hand, even weight wise, this actually feels a little bit lighter. I'll have to look up the exact specs of this one with a lens, but the balance on the Hasselblad, I dare say, like I said, I do love you, is better than the Sony A7R. The ergonomics, the entire time shooting, I brought this out literally in a hurricane last week. The weather sealing held up perfectly. The grip, absolutely a joy to use. Everything else is wonderful. The outside edges of this, be careful because there is a tiny bit of a wear mark. If you carry this around your neck and it rubs a lot, those edges, even though they're not really sharp, they're not uncomfortable to hold by any means, but you may start seeing a little bit of wear on there before you thought you might. All right, even the Mona Lisa's falling apart. It's time for the good, the bad, and the not so ugly. I'm sure have heard that this had some problems when it was first released with the boot times, some lag times, some actual freezing, and some blacking out where you would have to take the battery out of the entire camera to resolve those. I'm happy to say that the new firmware updates, as well as bringing in the electronic shutter, that touch AF focus points that I love so much, actually has resolved a lot of those problems, but it did freeze on me one time, and I missed a very, very decent, is what I think it would be, a very, very decent shot. So I have to say about that, X1D performs beautifully 99.9% of the time in my experience, but there again, I did miss a picture from it. The boot time, it's about 6 seconds or so. That didn't bother me that much. That being said, this one, even though it is listed as being okay for street photography at times, it is not the best in terms of autofocusing. Namely because it is a contrast only autofocus other than a phase detect. That means it's going to look for those high contrast areas. It's not slow unless you need it to be really fast, if that makes any sense to you. I ran into a gentleman, Jake Snake. Hey again, man, if you're watching this. I ran into a gentleman and I was taking his picture riding his big bike in Great Smoky Mountain National Park a few weeks ago. And I was trying to focus on him as he was moving, and maybe 3 out of 5 shots came out okay. The rest of them just virtually unusable because of the blur. So for slow moving objects, you're going to be fine. For stationary objects, you're going to be fine, of course. But if you get into some high speed stuff, I mean, you're not going to want to take this to the racetrack, folks. Video. Nope. This thing is capable of video. I'm actually not even going to discuss it because, come on guys, you're not buying this for video. At least I don't think you are. If you are, good on you. But this is not the video camera that you're going to want. This is the absolute high resolution, beautiful imagery workhorse for still photography. So if you want to check out the video, I'm sure there's plenty of, ironically, videos talking about the video of the X1D. And last but not least, I want to talk about my impressions of the touchscreen on this, which I really didn't think I was going to like. This is the first camera I've ever used that had a touchscreen. I didn't think I would like it. I really thought that I would be messing with it all the time, accidentally bumping it. That's actually not the case, and I truthfully have been a little spoiled using the touchscreen on this. It's just so intuitive and actually so well laid out and so easy to read and see that I'm actually ashamed that I thought that I wouldn't enjoy having a touchscreen on this thing. As far as real world work goes, I use this here in the home studio to make actually some self-portraits of me. Go figure, I do that about twice a year. And that actually blew me away. The color depth, the skin tone, again, that beautiful contrast, the dynamic range, that medium format feel and that medium format flavor to the images, absolutely beautiful, even if I'm in them. I did some landscape work, I did some long exposure stuff on some water. Those were great. I haven't actually had the chance to use this in low light for astrophotography, the 90mm lens, even with that 0.8 crop factor, just a little bit tight for doing some of the things I normally did. But with that 14 stops of dynamic range and the low light performance, even at higher ISOs, it's going to be hard to say that this thing wouldn't perform beautifully in low light. Okay, the $10,000 question is, do I think the X1D from Hasselblad is worth the price? It is, unless it isn't. I know that might not make sense. The reason I say that is, take me for example. I am, believe it or not, a working professional photographer. I do a lot of other things, but that is my stock and trade. I rely on my cameras for my livelihood, essentially. And do I think this would be worth it for me? Yeah, this thing goes for about $6,500 now on B&H and Amazon. I think on Amazon it's $64.95, you know, free shipping, if that helps. But if I had the money, would I spend that much money on this camera? I think I might. And I say that wholeheartedly. I know that on top of that, that's the body only for this camera. And I think the 90mm here, I think it runs for maybe $3,100 on Amazon right now. So you'd be having a $6,500 camera and a $3,100 lens. You know, you're pushing a $10,000 investment for one of these. Now, if I were to find one used, like I do most of my cameras, no question I would get the X1D. It's worth the full price, in my opinion, if you want what I would consider the best camera in terms of not only ergonomics and aesthetics, but also image quality, contrast, color, right out of the box. The raw files in this thing are beautiful. I hope the pictures that I'm showing you on here do this camera justice. So yes, if you made it to the end of the video, do I think this is worth it? I do. I think you need to have a very good understanding of who you are and what you want the camera for. This is not, I guess it could be a hobby camera for you if you've got that much cabbage, but it's not a camera that you want to go spend $10,000 on if you don't have a lot riding on it. But if you do want, hey, let's just say it, for some of the best pictures I've ever seen come out of a camera, Hasselblad X1D, I can personally recommend this. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up this episode of Straight Talk on Photography, covering the Hasselblad X1D medium format digital mirrorless camera with the 90mm f3.2 XCD lens. It's not cheap. It's not fast. Is it absolutely amazing? Yes. See you next time, everybody.